February 14th, 1943. Kasserine Pass, Tunisia. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel observes from his command post as the battle-hardened forces of the Afrika Korps slice through American lines like a hot knife through butter. In just 72 hours, German units had shattered the U.S. II Corps, captured hundreds of prisoners, and destroyed 183 Sherman tanks. American forces were retreating in total disarray. Music, ominous, low-frequency drone building into chaotic percussion. It was the first time the United States Army had faced the Wehrmacht in a large-scale land battle, and they were being massacred. That same night, Rommel drafted his assessment for the German High Command. His words left no room for doubt. The American troops lack combat experience. Their coordination is amateur. Music swells their commanders commit elementary errors. They do not represent a serious threat. The report reached Berlin with a devastating conclusion. The U.S. Army was a third-rate enemy. German officers read it with satisfaction. The Afrika Korps had confirmed what they all suspected. The Americans did not know how to fight. Scene 2. The Turn. But 3 months later, Rommel wrote a letter to his wife, Lucy, from Tunisia. His tone was completely different. I was wrong about the Americans. What I saw at Kasserine was not weakness, it was inexperience. And there is a critical difference. What happened in those 90 days to change the assessment of one of Germany's most brilliant commanders? The answer lies in a phenomenon the Germans had never witnessed before, the velocity of American adaptation. Music, uplevels to a driving, industrial rhythm. If you want to discover what Rommel saw that completely changed his mind, type Kasserine in the comments. This story will show you why subestimating American learning capabilities was one of Germany's greatest strategic blunders. Scene 3. The Intervention. To understand the transformation, you must go back to February 19th, 1943. 3 days after the debacle at Kasserine, General Dwight D. Eisenhower arrived at the front lines with an expression his officers described as contained fury. He didn't scream. He didn't threaten. He did something far more effective. He summoned every divisional commander to an emergency meeting. Gentlemen, Eisenhower said, I have just witnessed the most humiliating defeat in the history of the United States Army. And I'm going to tell you exactly why it happened. For the next 4 hours, Eisenhower dissected every tactical failure at Kasserine, not with hostility, but with surgical precision. Error: Sherman tanks had been committed in penny packets, small groups, against fortified German positions. Error: artillery had failed to coordinate with infantry. Error: battalion commanders lacked backup communications. Error: defensive positions lacked interlocking fields of fire. Music: tense, ticking clock sound. But what he said next changed everything. The Germans have been fighting for 3 years. We have been in real combat for 3 months. They are not better soldiers. They are soldiers with more experience. And we are going to acquire that experience faster than any army in history. Eisenhower relieved 3 generals that same week, not for cowardice, but for tactical incompetence. Major General Lloyd Fredendall, commander of the II Corps, was removed and sent back to the United States. In his place, Eisenhower appointed General George S. Patton. Scene 4. A New Doctrine. Patton arrived at II Corps headquarters on March 6, 1943, with a 1-page order that he distributed to every unit. The following tactics are forbidden immediately: frontal advances without reconnaissance, tank concentrations without infantry support, defensive positions without depth. Any officer employing them will be relieved of command without appeal. But he didn't stop there. Patton implemented something no army had done before on this scale: real-time tactical analysis teams. Every engagement was dissected within 24 hours. Every error was documented, analyzed, and communicated to all units. The Germans learned from experience accumulated over years. The Americans were creating a system to accelerate that learning curve into weeks. Scene 5. The Rematch. March 27, 1943.
El Guettar, Tunisia.
The U.S. 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, occupied defensive positions in the hills overlooking a narrow valley. Intelligence officers had detected the movement of German armor approaching. Rommel ordered an attack with the 10th Panzer Division. It was the same formation that had shredded American lines at Kasserine 5 weeks earlier. He expected the same result. What he found was a different war. German tanks entered the valley at 0643 hours. The American positions remained silent. German commanders interpreted this as panic. They accelerated their advance. Music, intense battle drums. Error. At 0651 hours, when the German column reached the kill zone in the middle of the valley, American positions opened fire simultaneously. The artillery had been pre-registered on specific coordinates. The Schumanns did not attack frontally. They were positioned in hull-down defilade on the elevated flanks with interlocking lines of fire. Infantry occupied support positions with bazookas, ready for any tank that breached the line. It was a combined arms ambush coordinated with millimeter precision. In 23 minutes, the 10th Panzer Division lost 32 tanks, 17 armored personnel carriers, and approximately 350 men. The Americans suffered fewer than 20 casualties. Rommel observed the disaster from his command post. His chief of staff, General Fritz Bayerlein, was perplexed. "Sir, these are not the same soldiers we faced at Kasserine." Rommel didn't answer immediately. He was studying the American positions through his binoculars. "No," he finally said. "They are exactly the same soldiers. But someone taught them to think." Scene 6. Industrial Warfare. What Rommel had witnessed was not gradual improvement. It was a systematic transformation. The Americans had analyzed every error from Kasserine and created specific countermeasures, not just for one battle, but for an entire combat system. But Rommel had not yet seen the most devastating part of American capability. That would come 2 weeks later. April 7, 1943. Near Mata, Tunisia. Lieutenant Colonel Karl Goldschmidt of the Afrika Korps captured American documents after a skirmish. He sent them to Rommel with a note. "Sir, you need to read this immediately." They were tactical manuals, dated barely 8 days prior. They contained detailed analyses of German formations, updated engagement protocols, and specific countermeasures for panzer tactics. Rommel read them twice, then called for Bayerlein. "How long did it take us to develop our panzer doctrine manuals?" "Approximately 3 years, sir. Between 1936 and 1939. The Americans have just revised their entire tactical doctrine music in 6 weeks." Bayerlein said nothing. There was nothing to say. The Germans had spent years perfecting armored warfare. The Americans were compressing that learning process at a pace that defied military logic. But there was something else in those documents that deeply disturbed Rommel. The manuals didn't just describe how to counter German tactics, they described how the Germans would likely adapt to those countermeasures and how the Americans should respond to that adaptation. The Americans weren't playing at the same level as the Germans. They were playing 2 moves ahead. Rommel wrote in his diary that night, "We are facing an enemy that treats war as industrial engineering. Music they analyze, they adjust, they improve. What took Germany a decade to develop, they are replicating in months. If this war continues for another 2 years, their advantage will be insurmountable." Scene 7. The Legacy. April 23, 1943. Rommel was evacuated from Tunisia for medical reasons. Before leaving, he wrote his final assessment of U.S. forces. This report was classified and not discovered until after the war. "My initial assessment of the American army was music correct in the details, but wrong in the conclusion. Their troops at Kasserine lacked experience. Their commanders made elementary errors. But I interpreted this as inherent weakness. It was actually undeveloped adaptability. The difference is critical. A weak army remains weak. A learning army becomes lethal." He continued, "The Americans possess 3 advantages that no other army has combined: unlimited industrial resources, an educational system that fosters critical thinking, and a culture that does not fear admitting mistakes and correcting them publicly. At Kasserine, We defeated them because they were inexperienced. At El Getter, they stopped us because they had learned. If we face them again in 6 months, they will surpass us. The report never reached the public in Berlin. The German High Command considered it defeatist and suppressed it. But Rommel was right. July 10, 1943. 5 months after Kasserine, U.S. forces landed in Sicily, Operation Husky, with a coordination that left British military observers astonished. Music. The same 1st Infantry Division that had been battered in Tunisia now executed complex amphibious operations with Germanic precision. Sherman tanks, once easily destroyed, now operated in devastating combined arms formations. Artillery that had failed to coordinate now delivered time-on-target barrages synchronized to the second. And the commanders who had made elementary errors were now executing maneuvers that German generals described in their reports as professionalism of the highest quality. June 6, 1944. Normandy. U.S. forces participated in the largest amphibious landing in history, not as inexperienced troops, but as a fully developed machine of war. Rommel, now commanding the Atlantic Wall defenses, immediately recognized the level of sophistication. His private aides later reported hearing him murmur while reviewing the situation reports, "We gave them too much time to learn." In 16 months, the U.S. Army had gone from being a third-rate enemy to the most lethal force on the Western Front. The Germans had never seen anything like it because nothing like it had ever existed. Scene 8. Conclusion. What happened between Kasserine and Normandy was not natural maturation. It was learning engineering applied at an industrial scale. The U.S. Army created tactical analysis teams operating in real time, instant communication systems for lessons learned, rotations of experienced officers to train new divisions stateside, continuous revision of doctrine based on combat data. The Germans perfected their tactics over campaigns that lasted years. The Americans perfected theirs between battles that lasted weeks. It wasn't magic, it was method. And that method transformed an amateur army into a force that Rommel considered unbeatable. Rommel's final letter to his wife, music written in May 1944, summarizes it all. The Americans taught me that modern war is not one with naturally superior soldiers, it is one with superior systems of learning. They made more mistakes in 6 months than we did in 3 years, music, but they learned from every single one. We keep repeating the same ones. Kasserine Pass was not the humiliation that defined the American Army. It was the starting point of the fastest transformation in modern military history. Rommel understood this before anyone else in the German High Command. That understanding filled him with something few German generals felt in 1943, fear. Because he had seen the future, and in that future, an army that learns faster than anyone else will always win. What do you think of this extraordinary transformation? Did you know about Rommel's reassessment of U.S. forces after Kasserine? Leave a comment on how the ability to learn quickly can be more lethal than initial experience. Subscribe to the channel for more verified histories that changed the course of World War II. Every week, we bring you historical analysis